This wild German shepherd attacked everyone, until a veteran changed everything in seconds. The storm had rolled in early over Cedar Ridge, dragging a slice of winter across the mountain town long before the season was due. The sky hung low and bruised. The air carried that sharp, metallic quiet that arrived only when something was about to go wrong. People kept to their homes, doors locked, lights dimmed. Only the echo of distant sirens cut through the cold morning air. The sirens were not meant for a fire, nor for a crash, but for a dog. Rogue. The German shepherd had been spotted again near the abandoned mill, tearing apart trash bins and lunging at hikers who wandered too close. Every deputy in Cedar Ridge knew the name. The dog was a shadow that moved too fast, a blur of teeth and fear. More than once it had sent grown men scrambling up the hood of their trucks. No one could get close, and no one knew where it came from. This time, the county finally made a decision. They were done trying to lure it with food or tranquilizer darts. They were sending Rogue to a military training center an hour south, hoping someone would know how to handle a shepherd that acted like it had survived a war. The cage waited on the back of the county transport truck, thick steel bars and a reinforced lock. The deputies had spent 2 hours cornering Rogue, herding it away from the cliffs, pushing it into that crate with poles and boards. Even inside the cage, Rogue snarled and threw its weight against the metal like it wanted to break the world in half. Deputy Harris slammed the truck door shut, breath fogging. He muttered a curse and wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. I swear this thing isn't normal. He wasn't wrong. The truck rolled forward. Snow flurried around the tires as they left the mill road and cut towards the highway. For a few long minutes, everything stayed quiet, almost peaceful. But then Rogue shifted. Its ears perked. Its muscles tightened like it heard something no human could. And then it snapped. The shepherd slammed into the crate so hard the bolts screamed. Metal bent. One hinge tore loose. Harris yelled just as Rogue hit the door a second time. The latch burst open. The cage door flew wide, and the dog leapt free. The truck skidded sideways, fishtailing on the icy road. Harris grabbed the wheel, shouting into the radio, but Rogue didn't run for the trees. It ran alongside the truck, pacing it with terrifying precision, eyes locked on the driver window. Then it cut sharply across the road. Harris swerved. The truck clipped a snowbank and crashed into a drift. The world went quiet again. Rogue stood in the middle of the road, chest heaving, frost steaming off its fur. Its eyes were wild, but behind that chaos was something else. Something sharper. Something that wasn't born from instinct alone. The deputies scrambled out, weapons drawn, but Rogue didn't attack. It didn't flee. It simply watched them, ears twitching like it was listening for a voice that wasn't there. That was when a second engine rumbled up the hill. A green Tacoma stopped a few yards away. The door swung open, and Mason Clark stepped out into the cold. He didn't look like he belonged in Cedar Ridge. His build was too rigid, his shoulders too square, his gaze too controlled. The kind of man who moved like he was still on deployment even when he wasn't. Rumors said Mason had once been a Marine handler overseas, that he'd walked out of Afghanistan with scars no one could see and memories he refused to talk about. He tossed a pair of gloves onto the seat and approached slowly. "What the hell happened here?" he asked. Harris pointed at Rogue. "It got out. Nearly flipped the damn truck. It's not right, Mason. There's something wrong with it." Mason's eyes narrowed as he studied the shepherd. He didn't see madness. He didn't see a feral animal. He saw a stance he recognized. A dog bracing for an enemy it couldn't find. A dog that had learned pain the hard way, not the natural way. He took a step forward. Rogue growled, a deep, rolling sound that vibrated through the cold air. The deputies raised their rifles. Mason raised a hand for them to stop. "Let me try." He moved closer, slow, controlled, boots crunching on hard snow. Rogue's snarl intensified. Its hackles lifted, teeth bared. It was ready to lunge. But then something happened that froze everyone. Rogue hesitated, only for a heartbeat, but it was real. Its eyes flicked, not to Mason's hands, not to his stance, but to his scars. The faint lines trailing down Mason's left forearm, half hidden beneath his jacket sleeve. Old wounds, deep wounds, wounds left by another shepherd long ago. Rogue's growl stuttered. The rage in its eyes shifted into confusion, like it was trying to place a memory buried under instinct and fear. Deputy Harris whispered, "Did it just stop?" Mason didn't answer. He crouched down, lowering himself to the dog's level. The cold wind pushed between them, carrying the quiet of the mountains, the kind that felt like the world was holding its breath. "Easy," Mason murmured. "Nobody's here to hurt you." Rogue took one step back, then one forward, torn between fight and recognition. And then, from the woods, a branch snapped, sharp, intentional. Rogue whirled toward the sound instantly, ears pinned forward, body locked into alert. Not fear, not confusion. Recognition. The dog wasn't trying to escape the deputies. It was trying to escape whoever was hiding in those trees. Before Mason could react, Rogue bolted toward the forest with the force of a bullet. The deputies shouted. Harris reached for his radio again. But Mason stood frozen, heart pounding, watching the shepherd vanish into the shadows of Cedar Ridge. That hesitation Rogue showed him for a single second wasn't an accident. It wasn't instinct. It was memory. Something had happened to that dog, something buried under frost, violence, and fear. And someone out there wasn't done with it yet. Mason took one slow breath, snow swirling around him. Whatever Rogue was running from, it wasn't done chasing. And neither was Mason. They brought Rogue in at dawn. The Cedar Ridge K9 Center was nothing fancy. A converted maintenance building on the edge of town with a narrow gravel lot, a handful of indoor runs, and a training field that used to be part of a high school football practice ground. Most days it smelled like bleach, coffee, and wet fur. This morning, it smelled like fear. Mason stood by the chain-link fence, hands in the pockets of his jacket, watching the county transport back up to the rear bay. He had not meant to be here. After Rogue disappeared into the trees the day before, he had driven home, convinced himself it was over. Then his phone had rung at midnight. It was Harris. They found him. The dog came back on his own. "We got him in a crate at the K9 Center, but he is breaking everything he can reach. Director says we need someone who understands these dogs. You are the only one in this zip code who even comes close." Mason had said no, then yes. The yes came from somewhere he did not want to examine. Now he watched as two deputies slid the bay door up. The noise alone made his stomach tighten. Inside, the crate that held Rogue shuddered on its wheels. Metal clanged against metal as the shepherd hurled himself at the sides. Director Carla Jennings stood a few yards away under the eave, arms folded, a clipboard tucked tight against her chest. She was in her 40s, tough, tired, and carried herself like a woman who had seen one too many bad outcomes. "This is the last time I let the county dump a dog like that on my doorstep without warning," she muttered. "You are sure about this, Clark?" "No," he said, "but you are out of options." She gave a humorless snort. "Fair enough." The deputies rolled the crate down the ramp. Rogue exploded again, slamming his body into the front door. Spit flew through the bars. His voice was not a bark. It was a raw, hoarse roar that came from bone deep. Lily, the young vet tech, winced. "He has been like that all night," she said softly to Mason. "Every time anyone walked past his run. He went through 2 water buckets. I thought he was going to crack his teeth on the bars." Mason stepped closer, studying the dog. Rogue's coat was a mess, mottled grey and black and white beneath dried mud and burrs. One ear had an old tear. There were scars under the fur on his shoulders, not from one fight, but from many. His paws were scraped raw from throwing himself against things that would not move. Yet nothing in his posture said random. His eyes did not drift. They locked onto threats, then the corners, then the door, then the ceiling. He was mapping the room even as he raged against it. "Get him into quarantine," Carla ordered. "Harris, Martinez on the sides. And for the love of God, stay clear of..." His teeth. They maneuvered the crate into an empty run. Harris kicked the heavy gate closed behind it and slid the bolt home. Only then did he reach for the front of the crate. The moment the latch clicked, Rogue hit it. Harris jerked his hand away, just in time. "Jesus," he looked back at Mason. "Tell me again why we aren't just putting him down." "Because he is not crazy," Mason said. "He is scared. There is a difference." Harris gave a look that said he was not sure he believed that. Carla turned to Mason. "Here is the deal. The county signed off on a temporary hold. We are supposed to evaluate him for possible transfer to a federal K-9 program, but after last night they are leaning hard on behavioral euthanasia. I have 72 hours before they call asking for a decision. You have 24 before I make my recommendation. Can you help him or not?" Mason looked past her at Rogue. The dog had stopped slamming the crate door. He was pacing now, nose low, tail rigid and low, but not tucked. Every few seconds he would stop, lift his head, and stare at the far wall like he could see through it. "I do not know yet," Mason said, "but I can try." He stepped toward the run. Harris instinctively grabbed his arm. "You saw the report?" Harris said. "He went for my face yesterday. That thing is waiting for someone to get close enough to ruin..." Mason gently pulled free. "That is the problem. Everyone keeps calling him a thing." He stopped 3 feet from the gate. Rogue froze. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The dog lunged once, hitting the wire with his front paws. The gate shuddered. His teeth snapped inches from Mason's hand. Carla sucked in a breath. Mason did not flinch. He did not hold out a treat or croon baby talk or snap a command. He simply shifted his weight, turning his body sideways, presenting his shoulder instead of his chest. Less threat, less challenge. Rogue's snarl wavered. His ears, pinned flat, trembled. His eyes flicked from Mason's face to his boots, then up again. The dog let out a rough huff, as if angry that his usual tactics were not working. "You are not just mad, are you?" Mason said quietly. "Somebody taught you where the danger is." Carla frowned. "You see something I do not?" Mason kept his voice low. "Watch his eyes. He is not just throwing himself at the gate. He is checking the vents, the hinges, the dark corners. He is not panicking. He is problem-solving. That is not comforting." Harris muttered, "That is worse." Mason might have agreed if not for the other thing he saw. Every time Rogue's gaze passed over him, there was a hitch. A tiny pause, almost invisible, like recognition bumping against a closed door. Mason had felt that before, a lifetime ago, in a place where the air always smelled like diesel and dust. Afghanistan had not left him. It lived behind his eyes, in the way he scanned rooms, in the way he never sat with his back to a door. It haunted his sleep with the sound of a single explosion, replaying in different ways. And with it came Rebel. Rebel had been his partner. Black and tan, ears like radar, drive like a bullet. Together they had run dozens of patrols, swept dozens of roads, caught the scent of explosives days before anyone else suspected a threat. Until the mission where Mason got cocky. Until the day the command came down, rushed and half thought through. "Push to the village. No time for a full sweep. We need speed, not caution." Mason had listened. Rebel had not. The dog had stopped, stiffened, given that tiny sign that meant danger. Mason had weighed the odds, counted the seconds, and pushed forward anyway. The blast that followed still lived in his bones. He had walked away physically intact. Rebel had not. Everyone called it unavoidable. Everyone praised Rebel as a hero. Mason heard only the sound of his own voice, ordering forward when they should have pulled back. There was no medal for that. Only night after night on a mountain, building distance between himself and everything that knew him as a handler who had failed his dog. Now another shepherd stared at him through wire, holding the same kind of heat in his eyes. Lily cleared her throat, pulling him out of the memory. "Do you want me to get a catchpole at least? Just in case?" "No," Mason said. "If we start with a fight, that is all he will remember." He reached slowly up to his collar and unzipped his jacket halfway. The scar down his forearm was visible now, the old shrapnel burn. Rogue's eyes snagged on it, just for a heartbeat. "There it is," Mason whispered. Rogue shifted his weight. His paws scraped the concrete. He was still tense, but the rabid edge to his rage had dulled. He let out a low grumble, as if thinking something through. Without looking away, Mason dropped into a crouch. At this angle, the dog's head was level with his chest. He extended his hand, palm down, fingers relaxed, letting it rest on the cold concrete just inside the gate. The room went very still. Rogue stared at the hand. His ears tipped forward half an inch. His nostrils flared, taking in the scent. Pine smoke, old leather, gun oil, a hint of antiseptic from the scar. "Come on," Mason said softly. "You do not have to like me. Just decide I am not going to hurt you." Rogue inched forward. One step, another. Every muscle in his body screamed to spring, to bite, to push this human away before he could do whatever humans always did. But something deeper held him. He lowered his head. His nose touched Mason's knuckles, hot and damp. The air between them shifted. For the first time since they put him in the crate, Rogue's tail moved. Not a wag, just a twitch like he was testing the memory of how to do it. Lily's breath caught. Carla didn't move. Mason did not smile, did not reward. He just let the moment exist. Then the overhead lights flickered. It was nothing. An old ballast whining. But the sudden pop and hum echoed too much like a distant blast. Rogue flinched so hard. His nails scraped sparks from the concrete. His eyes went white around the edges. The thin thread of trust snapped. He lunged, teeth flashing, and slammed into the gate with a roar. Lily yelped and stumbled back. Harris swore and grabbed for his taser on reflex. Mason jerked his hand out of reach just in time, falling back on one knee. The gate rattled. Saliva sprayed across his jacket. Rogue threw himself at the fence twice more, then backed into the rear corner of the run, chest heaving. His growl was back, full force. But beneath it his eyes looked haunted. Betrayed. Not by the people in front of him, but by something only he could hear. "He let you touch him," Lily whispered. "For a second. Did you see that?" "For a second is not enough," Harris said. Carla did not speak right away. She watched the dog. Then she looked at Mason. "It is more than we have had with any other aggressive intake this bad," she said. "Is it on purpose? All this?" Mason stared at Rogue. The dog stared back. Two soldiers on opposite sides of a wire fence, both trapped in places they did not choose. "He is not out of control," Mason said quietly. "He is doing what he was trained to do. Fight first, survive, look for exits. And he is waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Carla asked. Mason's answer came from a place of certainty he did not like. "Orders." Carla frowned. "You are saying he had a handler?" "I am saying he still does." Mason said. Somewhere along the line, someone taught him there was only one way to stay alive, And until we figure out who that was and what they turned him into, we are all just background noise to him." Carla glanced toward the office. The phone on her desk was blinking. The county line? She sighed. The big folks are not going to like that answer. Another small twist slid into place. Rogue was not just the town's problem or the county's. He might be somebody's unfinished business. Mason pushed himself to his feet, feeling the ache in his knees. "Then we better work fast," he said, "because he is not just angry. He has a mission, and if we do not give him a new one soon, he is going to follow the old one straight through whoever stands in his way." Rogue shifted in the corner, watching him, as if he understood every word. The morning broke colder than expected, the kind of bite-in-the-air chill that made even the metal kennels sweat with condensation. Mason arrived before sunrise, long before the staff clocked in. He preferred it that way. The quiet made it easier to think, and thinking was something he hadn't allowed himself much of in years. He walked down the concrete aisle lined with kennels until he reached Rogue's Run. The shepherd was awake, sitting rigid, ears forward, eyes already tracking him. There was no sleepy stretch, no tail thump. Rogue had spent the night watching shadows crawl across the walls. "You look like you didn't sleep either," Mason muttered. Rogue didn't blink. Carla asked him to do a basic sweep of the outdoor yard before the day shift arrived. The ground outside was hard from frost, but it was cleaner than yesterday's chaos. Mason unlatched the side gate and stepped into the training yard. Rogue followed, tethered by a 6-foot lead clipped to a thick harness. It was the only reason Carla allowed the dog outside at all. Rogue didn't pull, didn't sniff, didn't act like any dog should. He scanned, his head turned sharply, tracking sounds barely visible to human ears. A rustle, a creak, the distant crack of ice loosened by the sun. Then Rogue stopped moving entirely. Mason felt the leash grow taut, not from pulling but from focus. Rogue stood at the far corner of the yard, muscles tightened into a line of tension. "What is it?" Mason asked quietly. Rogue pawed the dirt once, twice. Then he began to dig. Not frantically, not like a bored dog. Purposeful, fast, determined. Claws scraped hard earth. Pebbles shot back toward Mason's boots. "Easy," he said, even though he didn't stop him. Rogue's breath hitched when he hit something solid. The dog froze. Then he began brushing the dirt aside with the side of his muzzle, like he had done this before, many times, in many different places. A small metal object surfaced under the morning light, half buried, half burned. Mason crouched beside him. It was a scorched piece of hardware, maybe the size of 2 fingers. One edge was jagged, the other curved with purpose. The surface bore marking patterns that were unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around classified tech. Mason felt his stomach drop. It looked like a fragment of a directional receiver, the kind used in covert operations, the kind never meant to be outside the hands of military personnel. Rogue let out a low chuff, almost impatient, as if urging him to see what he saw. "Where did you learn to find things like this?" Mason whispered. Rogue's eyes flicked up at him, sharp and intelligent. It wasn't the gaze of a feral dog. It was the gaze of something trained, conditioned, hardened. Mason picked up the metal fragment carefully. The frost made his fingers sting. He could almost feel the heat that must have scorched it days or weeks earlier. Whatever it had been part of, it wasn't small. Someone had been near this yard long before Rogue arrived. Mason turned the piece over, noting a faint serial groove on the underside. Numbers too small to make out without cleaning it, but the format was familiar. This was military issue. No question. He looked back at Rogue. The shepherd was pacing now, agitated, tail slicing the air in tight arcs. Not fear, not aggression. Recognition. Rogue's head snapped toward the tree line beyond the training field. The woods stood silent, but not silent in the natural way. This was a waiting silence, like something out there held its breath. Rogue growled, low, controlled, not meant for Mason. "What is it?" Mason murmured. Rogue stiffened, ears locked forward, his gaze drilled into one specific patch of trees. Then came the sound, a soft crunch of frost. Just one. But it was wrong for a deer, too clean for a falling branch, too deliberate for wind. Mason lifted his head, eyes narrowing. Someone's out there. Rogue lunged toward the fence, not violently, urgently. He wanted to go, not to attack, to warn, to complete whatever mission still lived inside him. Mason grabbed the leash with both hands to keep him from climbing the chain link. "Easy. You are not going out there without me." Rogue whipped his head back toward Mason and let out a frustrated bark. Not random. A message. Mason's pulse thudded. A cold thought slid through him. This dog knows more about that metal fragment than I do. Carla's voice broke the tension. "Clark, everything all right out here?" Mason turned just enough to see her standing in the doorway, coffee steaming in one hand. Behind her, Lily held a plastic container of meds and looked half asleep. "Find something?" Carla asked. Rogue gave another sharp bark. Mason held up the fragment. "This was buried in your yard." Carla stepped closer, frowning. "What is it? Something that shouldn't be here." Rogue pressed against Mason's leg, vibrating with tension. Then he stopped, dead still. His ears locked again on the forest. Lily swallowed hard. "He is freaking me out. It is like he knows something." "He does," Mason said. "And I think someone knows he's here." Before either woman could speak, another sound cracked through the air. A branch snapping deeper in the trees. Louder this time, closer. Carla turned sharply. "That is not normal." Mason scanned the tree line. Whoever was watching wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. They wanted him to know. He felt Rogue lean forward, not with aggression, with certainty. Mason's voice dropped to a whisper. "That wasn't an accident yesterday. Rogue didn't run from you. He ran from whoever was in those woods." The realization hit him hard. That hesitation Rogue had shown him yesterday. That instinctive pull toward the forest. The scars. The hyper-awareness. This was not a dog that attacked out of chaos. This was a dog that survived something structured, violent, intentional. Carla spoke quietly. "Clark, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking this dog didn't become Rogue on his own. Someone trained him, someone used him, and someone wants him back." Rogue growled again. Not at them, at whatever moved behind those trees. Mason clenched the metal fragment in his fist. Whatever Rogue had lived through hadn't ended. It had just followed him to Cedar Ridge. By noon, the frost had melted off the kennels, leaving thin rivulets of water dripping down the metal bars. The rest of the center bustled with routine noise, but Mason kept his distance. He had spent the last hour locked in Carla's office, combing through the digital intake file she forwarded to him. It was thin, too thin for a dog that nearly tore a transport truck apart. Rogue, male, estimated 3 years old, no microchip, no collar, found wandering near the burned-out storage depot on Route 19. Mason leaned back in the old office chair, frowning. The depot had gone up in flames 2 months ago. The official report had blamed faulty wiring, but half the county whispered a different theory. Phantom engines on the highway at night, men talking in the dark, then flames. No suspects, no answers. The file included one grainy cell phone photo of Rogue on the night he was found, standing in front of the smoldering ruins. His ribs showed through his fur. His eyes reflected green in the flash, but behind that reflection there was something else. Something devastated. Carla's voice cut through his thoughts. "That dog was half dead when they found him," she said, stepping into the office. "If he came from that depot, he came out of hell." Mason nodded. That place wasn't just a depot. Something else was inside, something that left this behind. He handed her the scorched metal fragment wrapped in a towel. She turned it over. "Looks like junk. Looks like classified junk," Mason corrected. "Military-grade navigation tech, at least part of one. But someone burned it, tore it apart, then left it in the dirt like it didn't matter." Carla's expression tightened. "You think Rogue was there when it blew?" "I think he survived something he wasn't supposed to." He didn't add the darker thought forming in his mind. "I think someone wanted that depot erased." Outside, Rogue barked once. Sharp, focused, not at random. Carla turned toward the window. "He is doing that every time someone walks too close to the fence line. It is like he is tracking shadows." Mason took a breath. "Let me take him out. Just in the yard. On leash." She hesitated, then opened the door. "You pull that dog too far outside protocol, and the county will bury us in paperwork." He gave a short nod. "I know the lines." He hoped it was true. Rogue was waiting at the gate when Mason approached, body taut, eyes alive with tension. But when Mason lifted the leash, Rogue didn't snap or lunge. He didn't even growl. Mason clipped the lead to the harness. "Ready?" Rogue exhaled once through his nose, almost like an answer. They stepped outside. The yard smelled of pine sap and damp soil. A light breeze carried the scent of the forest. Rogue moved with unnatural purpose, head low, sniffing the air as if reading it. Mason let him lead. Rogue guided him straight toward the back corner of the property, where the chain-link fence bowed slightly inward. There, the dog stopped. He stiffened, nose pressed to the lowest gap between fence and earth. "What is it?" Mason asked. Rogue pawed twice, then looked back at him. A signal, an instruction, something learned long ago. Mason knelt and cleared away the dead leaves with his glove. 2 footprints emerged beneath the debris. Recent, crisp, heel-heavy, like the person was carrying weight. Beside them lay a spent shell, casing, half sunk into the mud, a 9mm. Mason felt adrenaline tighten his chest. He picked it up, brushing off dirt. This wasn't practice shooting. This was someone firing into the woods. Rogue's growl vibrated through the air. Mason looked up. Rogue was staring past the fence, past the yard, straight into the first row of trees. His ears were forward, his tail rigid, his posture no longer aggressive but alert. Not fear, wariness, memory. Mason's throat tightened. This posture was familiar. He had seen it hundreds of times overseas. Rebel used to stand exactly like this when danger sat just beyond reach, unseen but certain. Rebel. The name crashed through Mason's mind before he could stop it. Suddenly the air wasn't cool mountain air anymore. It was the dust-choked heat of Helmand Province. The sky wasn't soft grey, but a harsh white glaring down on the desert. He could almost hear the distant thump of rotors, the shouted warnings, Rebel's bark echoing off broken walls, Rebel's final bark. Mason shut his eyes. He knew better than to chase ghosts, but they found him anyway. They always had. The memory rose uninvited and merciless. 3 years earlier, dawn patrol. Rebel walking 5 feet ahead, nose clicking back and forth. Mason telling the lieutenant they needed more time to sweep. Lieutenant waving him off. "Move, the convoy is closing in." No delays. Rebel had stopped. Mason had stepped forward anyway. The blast was sudden and absolute. Dust, fire, screams, and the weight of Rebel's body slamming into his chest, throwing him sideways. The world had gone black around the edges. When he woke, Rebel's collar was in his hand. Mason blinked hard, pulling himself back into the present. Rogue nudged his hand with his nose. A quiet gesture, a grounding one. "You all right?" Mason murmured. Rogue blinked slowly. Not hostile, not frantic, just watching him, like he recognized something reflected in Mason's eyes. The dog turned back toward the forest and emitted a soft whine. "Show me," Mason said. Rogue pulled gently on the lead, guiding him several steps along the fence. Then he stopped again and pressed his paw to another spot. More prints. Dry mud instead of frost this time. Someone had approached last night. Watched, waited. Carla's voice floated across the yard from behind them. "Clark, what did you find?" Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Rogue, who was now sitting in a perfect, controlled position. Not something a wild dog did. Something a trained dog did. "Sit." Mason whispered it under his breath. Rogue's ears flicked. "Stay." Rogue's chest rose, fell, but he did not move. Holy hell, Rogue wasn't just remembering commands, he was remembering how to work with a handler. Carla reached them and froze when she saw the prints. Her face tightened. "Those are fresh." Rogue whined again, glancing between Mason and the woods, urging, directing, pushing him toward them. A truth Mason wasn't sure he wanted. Carla exhaled sharply. "Clark, this is turning into something bigger than the county wants." Mason pocketed the shell casing. "Whoever was here last night, they are the reason Rogue ended up at that burned depot." He looked down at Rogue. And the reason he survived it. Rogue stood suddenly, muscles rippling under his fur. He nudged the fence with his nose, then stepped back, and looked at Mason with a stare so sharp it felt like language. "A request. Let me go. Let me show you." Mason tightened his grip on the leash. "Not yet," he said quietly. "We do this together." Rogue huffed once, not approval, not rejection, agreement. In that moment, Mason realized something undeniable. This dog had not been running from the world. He had been running from a war only he remembered. And Mason was now standing on the edge of it. The evening fog settled over Cedar Ridge like a warning. Thick, heavy, too quiet. Mason felt it the moment he stepped out of Carla's office with Rogue at his side. Something in the air wasn't right. The silence wasn't the natural mountain kind. It was the kind that follows someone holding their breath. Rogue sensed it first. His ears snapped forward, his posture locked, his tail dropped just enough to signal danger without panic. Then he growled, not at a person, not at a sound, but at a presence. "What do you hear?" Mason whispered. Rogue didn't answer with noise. He moved, not wildly, not aggressively. With precision, slipping into a half-crouched walk that looked far too practiced for a shelter dog. Mason followed him to the edge of the yard, where the fence pressed against the tree line. There, Rogue stopped abruptly and stared into the forest. A single twig cracked. Mason reached instinctively for the flashlight at his belt. "Come out," he said sharply. Nothing. But Rogue lunged. His body hit the end of the leash so hard it wrenched Mason forward. The shepherd's bark ripped through the fogged air like a warning siren, and for the first time, something else answered. Footsteps. Fast. Retreating. Someone had been standing just inside the trees. Rogue jerked against the leash again, frantic. Mason let him lead a few steps, but not into the forest. Not yet. The last thing they needed was Rogue disappearing into the dark, chasing someone willing to stalk a military training center. Carla and Lily ran out when they heard the noise. "What happened?" Carla called. Mason kept his eyes on the woods. Someone is out there again. This time closer. Before Carla could respond, Rogue barked sharply, then whimpered, a sound Mason had never heard from him before. The dog lifted one paw off the ground and shook it. Mason dropped to one knee. Blood streaked the fur between Rogue's toes. You cut yourself, he murmured. But as he inspected the paw, he found the truth. The cut was clean, straight, like a shallow slice from metal, not a random scrape. Carla's face tightened. Someone set something sharp out there. Booby traps, small, hidden. They were testing the perimeter. Mason stood slowly, adrenaline rising. This isn't random. Whoever wants him is getting bolder. Carla swallowed. You think it's the same person from the depot? No, Mason said quietly. Not a person, a group. He didn't elaborate. Not here. Not with open forest in front of them. They brought Rogue inside the observation building, where Mason cleaned the wound. Rogue didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He watched Mason with an unsettling stillness. This happened before, didn't it? Mason whispered. Someone used you, hurt you, built you for something you didn't choose. Rogue blinked, slow and heavy. The room dimmed as the sun set behind the ridge. Mason placed the metal shard they found earlier on the table, the faint cereal marks clearer now under the lamp. Carla leaned against the wall. You've been staring at that thing for an hour. Tell me what you see. Mason sat down. The pattern on the edge isn't from a normal receiver. It's from a directional routing node, one used for encoded transport signals, high-grade, military, restricted. She frowned. Why would anyone hide stolen tech in a storage depot? That's the question, Mason murmured. And I think I have a name. He tapped his laptop screen, where he'd pulled up an old, sealed investigative report. It included a grainy mugshot of a man in his late 40s, someone who wore confidence like armor. Conrad Hale. Carla recoiled. That Conrad Hale? The ex-federal agent who disappeared after the weapons smuggling scandal? The same. I thought he died years ago, she whispered. Mason shook his head. They never found a body. They just closed the file to avoid embarrassment. Carla looked at Rogue. And you're saying he made this dog? Mason's expression hardened. Not made. Broke. A chill washed over the room. He continued. Hale ran a covert operation smuggling unauthorized tech out of classified facilities. Rumor was he used dogs, unregistered, unmonitored, to transport or scout during trades. When his network collapsed, the feds raided one of his safe depots. There was an explosion. Most of the evidence burned. Carla pieced it together, except one thing ran out of the fire. Rogue. Mason nodded. And now Hale wants whatever survived that explosion. Lily stepped closer to the table. So the metal fragments Rogue keeps finding are pieces Hale wants back before anyone can trace them. Carla's voice dropped, and he's watching us. Rogue let out a soft growl, confirming it. Mason paced the room, putting the puzzle together. Rogue was tested, trained, pushed past safe limits. When that depot went up, Rogue must have escaped. Hale lost control of his operation, but he didn't lose interest. Rogue still remembers. That's why he reacts to the forest. He knows they're out there, tracking him. Carla looked at the dog with new fear. What are they planning? Mason leaned over the table. Hale doesn't want Rogue back because he cares. He wants him back because the dog knows where the rest of the smuggled equipment burned. Rogue was there when it happened. He remembers more than he understands. Rogue moved closer to Mason's leg, resting his head against his thigh. Not out of fear, out of trust. You're remembering things, aren't you? Mason whispered. Commands, people, pain. Rogue's ears lowered just a fraction, an acknowledgement. Lily murmured. He listens to you. The others he fights. But you, he follows. Carla exhaled heavily. Clark, if Hale is alive, you're up against someone who used to outrank the entire county. Someone with reach, connections, money. Mason crouched beside Rogue again. I don't care who he is. I care that he's hunting a dog who didn't ask for any of this. He checked the cut one more time. It was shallow, manageable, but it meant something important. Hale wasn't circling anymore. He was making contact. Mason stood. "I'm taking Rogue out at dawn tomorrow, into the woods, to see what he's trying to show me." Carla grabbed his arm. "That is insane! Hale could be waiting." "Exactly," Mason said. "And Rogue knows his patterns. I need him to lead me. He isn't just reacting, he's remembering." Rogue's gaze locked with Mason's. They understood each other without a word. Carla whispered, "You're putting your life in the paws of a dog who was trained by a criminal." Mason answered without hesitation, "No, I'm trusting a survivor who keeps trying to tell us the truth." Outside, the fog thickened into a wall. Inside, Rogue lifted his head, eyes sharp, stance ready. The war that shaped him was no longer behind him. It had arrived at their door. Night dropped onto Cedar Ridge like a closing fist. The center usually hummed softly after sunset, but tonight the air was hollow, drained of every familiar sound. Even the wind felt careful, brushing the chain-link fences in thin, nervous breaths. Mason sensed it first. Rogue sensed it a heartbeat later. Something was coming. Mason stepped out of the small staff office, rubbing his shoulder where an old shrapnel scar pulsed in the cold. Rogue followed close behind, stiff and alert, tail motionless. His nostrils flared twice, sharply. Then he froze, staring into the darkness beyond the unfinished training yard. "What do you smell?" Mason whispered. Rogue's fur rose along his spine. His body hardened into a posture Mason recognized from another life, another war. Enemy. A faint click echoed, metal against metal. Then the entire center's power cut out. Darkness swallowed the compound. Mason drew a sharp breath. That wasn't a power outage. Someone killed the grid. Lily's frightened voice rang across the courtyard. "Mason, the lights! Get inside!" Mason shouted. But it was too late. Figures poured through the back gate, silhouettes moving with precision. Not amateurs, trained men. Armed, moving in a silent V formation toward the main building. Rogue let out a low, shaking growl that sounded nothing like fear. It was memory resurfacing. Mason realized it instantly. "You know them." Rogue's growl deepened. Yes, he knew them all too well. Conrad Hale stepped forward from the rear of the group, his flashlight beam cutting across the dirt. He wore a tactical jacket, no insignia, and a confident smirk that came from years of getting away with the unforgivable. "Evening, Clark." Mason felt Rogue shift closer, muscles tight. "You came for the dog," Mason said. "And everything he took from me," Conrad replied. "That animal cost me millions in equipment, months of planning, and 3 good men. 3 men who tortured him," Mason snapped. Conrad laughed. He wasn't tortured. He was trained. And he broke. That makes him unreliable. He lifted a gloved hand. "Take him." The command cracked like ice. 2 men moved in with tranquilizer rifles. Rogue snarled, teeth flashing white in the dark, but Mason yanked him behind the supply shed. "Move, Rogue! Move!" Gunfire ripped through the yard, bullets punching holes through the aluminum siding. Rogue pressed his body against Mason's leg, shielding him despite the chaos. "Rogue, go!" Mason hissed. But the dog refused to leave him. A tranquilizer dart struck the ground inches from Mason's feet. They sprinted toward the storage hangar, the only place with solid walls thick enough to buy time. Mason shoved the door closed just as another volley of bullets hit the metal, ringing like a bell underwater. Inside, the space was dark, lit only by moonlight slipping through the high windows. Stacks of training crates formed narrow corridors. It smelled of dust, rubber, and old engine oil. Mason checked his pockets. No phone, no radio. Rogue stood beside him, trembling, not with fear, but rage. A history Mason couldn't see was tearing its way back to the surface. Tell me what they did to you. Mason whispered. What made you run? Outside, Conrad's voice echoed. He's cornered. Sweep the building. Boots crunched across gravel. Rogue let out a single bark. Not loud, not panicked. A signal. They're coming from the west door. Mason realized. Rogue had warned him. Mason crouched beside the shepherd, touching the side of his neck where the fur was rougher, coarser. This dog had once worn a shock collar, a training device, a punishment device. Whatever Conrad called it, Rogue had endured it, and then escaped. That was the twist that hit Mason like a blow. Rogue wasn't violent because he was broken. He was violent because he survived breaking free. You didn't run from them, Mason whispered. You ran through them. The realization clicked into place. Rogue had attacked people in Cedar Ridge because he was fighting off shadows that looked like Conrad's men. Not innocent townsfolk, echoes of captors. He wasn't a danger. He was a warning. The hangar door buckled as one of the intruders tested it. Mason grabbed a metal rod leaning against a crate. Not a weapon he preferred. But enough. Stay behind me, he whispered. Rogue stepped in front of him. The first man burst through the west door. Rogue shot forward, silent as lightning. His body slammed into the intruder's chest, knocking him flat. The sound of the impact echoed across the hangar. The shepherd's jaws clamped down on the man's wrist, ripping the rifle from his grip. Mason took down the second man with a swing of the metal rod. Pain shot up his arm as the man hit the ground. Then he heard it, the distinct click of a pistol being cocked. Conrad stood in the center aisle, gun raised. Enough games. Mason shoved Rogue aside, stepping into the line of fire. Conrad fired. The bullet grazed Mason's shoulder, spinning him and dropping him hard onto the crate behind him. Rogue reacted so fast, the air didn't have time to carry the gunshot's echo. The shepherd lunged at Conrad with a roar that came from somewhere deep, somewhere old. He struck Conrad at the hip, knocking the gun away. Conrad stumbled, falling back into a stack of crates that collapsed and pinned him to the ground. Rogue stood over him, teeth at his throat. Conrad's voice shook. Call him off! He'll kill me! Mason pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder, cold sweat rolling down his spine. He stepped toward the pair. Rogue, hold! To Carla and Lily's shock, now appearing at the doorway with sheriff deputies, Rogue obeyed instantly. He didn't tear into Conrad. He didn't attack further. He stayed perfectly still, breathing hard, eyes locked. Mason knelt beside the shepherd. You remembered, didn't you? Not their training. Not their commands. Ours, the kind meant to protect, not harm. Rogue blinked. Calm, steady. Sheriff Tate cuffed Conrad while deputies dragged his men from the hangar. Lights flashed across the windows as backup arrived. Carla ran to Mason, kneeling beside him. You're bleeding. I'll live, Mason muttered. Lily stared at Rogue, awe in her voice. He saved you. No, Mason said quietly, watching the shepherd lower his head into his lap. We saved each other. Outside, the sirens faded. The hangar grew quiet. Rogue sat beside Mason, wounded paw resting against his boot, chest rising and falling slowly. For the first time, Mason placed his hand fully on Rogue's head, and Rogue leaned into the touch like he'd been waiting for it all his life. The sun rose slowly over Cedar Ridge the morning after the raid, warm light spilling across the training center's dirt lot as if the mountains were finally exhaling. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel tense. It felt relieved. Conrad Hale was in federal custody by dawn. His men were loaded into unmarked vehicles, wrists bound, heads down. Agents moved through the center gathering evidence, photographing every shard, every device, every cut fence line. What had once been rumor was now a full-blown case. The smuggling ring was dead. And the dog they blamed for every violent incident in town stood quietly beside Mason, watching everything with steady eyes. Rogue wasn't the monster Cedar Ridge had feared. He was the proof of what Conrad had done, proof of what he had survived. By late morning, Sheriff Tate approached Mason with a firm but softened expression. "Clark, the report's done. We're clearing Rogue of all prior incidents. He wasn't aggressive without cause. He was responding to trauma." Mason nodded, unable to hide the breath of relief that left him. "About damn time." Tate crouched slightly, giving Rogue space but making eye contact. "You're free now, big guy." Rogue blinked, ears flicking forward, but he didn't step back. He didn't growl. He simply accepted the words like he understood them. Carla and Lily joined them near the hangar, both carrying exhaustion in the face but pride in the shoulders. "The town council already called," Lily said. "They want to release a statement this afternoon. Rogue is officially, well, a survivor. A hero, actually." Carla smiled. "And there's talk of a community event to thank him. We might finally get people to stop calling him the Wild Shepherd." Mason stroked Rogue's neck, fingers brushing the rough patches where old scars hid beneath the fur. "He's not wild. He's waking up." Rogue turned towards him, pressing his forehead against Mason's chest. The movement was soft, intentional, and it hit Mason so hard his legs almost gave. Because years ago, on a dusty road in Helmand Province, another shepherd had done the exact same thing. Koba, Mason's partner, his shadow, the dog he couldn't save the night everything went wrong. Mason had replayed that moment for years, the weight of Koba's head against him, the promise that they would both get home, and the scream of the explosion that tore that future apart. He hadn't let anyone touch that memory. Until Rogue. Mason's breath shook as he lowered to a knee. Rogue followed him down, placing one paw on Mason's thigh as if anchoring him to the ground. The world blurred around the edges. But Mason didn't fight it. For the first time since the war, he didn't feel like he was standing alone. That's when it happened. The quiet, unexpected catharsis. Rogue lifted his head and placed it gently over Mason's heart, exactly like Koba used to. Carla and Lily exchanged a glance but didn't interrupt. They understood something sacred was unfolding. Mason closed his eyes. The ache he'd carried for years loosened. The guilt that had gnawed at him since Afghanistan softened. Rogue wasn't replacing Koba. He wasn't fixing the past. But he was giving Mason the one thing he thought he'd lost forever. A chance to breathe again. Later that afternoon, Cedar Ridge gathered near the old fire tower for a small, informal meeting. Nothing official, just neighbors showing up because they wanted to do better than they had before. People approached Rogue cautiously, respectfully. Children peeked from behind their parents, whispering the name they used to say with fear. "That's him, the Wild One." But now there was wonder in their voices. Sheriff Tate cleared his throat. "Folks, this dog saved a life last night. Maybe more than one. He stopped a criminal we didn't even know was in our backyard. And he did it because he's not dangerous. He's loyal." Rogue sat beside Mason, alert but calm, watching the crowd with those amber, steady eyes. A young boy stepped forward first, maybe 9 years old, wearing a faded red sweatshirt. He held out his hand, shaking slightly. "Can I pet him?" Mason looked at Rogue. The shepherd flicked his ears, then lowered his head toward the boy. "Yes," Mason said. "You can." The boy knelt and touched Rogue's fur. Rogue didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into it softly. The boy's eyes went wide. "He's not scary at all." Mason smiled. No, he never was. The crowd warmed. People stepped closer. A few reached out to pat Rogue's back or scratch behind his ears. Older residents who once demanded the dog be removed from town now stood quietly, humbled by how wrong they'd been. By evening, the tension that had shadowed Cedar Ridge for months had melted away, replaced by something gentler. Acceptance, healing, a promise to do better. As the sky dimmed, Mason sat with Rogue on the ridge overlooking the center. The forest was calm, no longer whispering threats. The wind moved through the trees like a tired guardian finally letting itself rest. "You did good, buddy," Mason murmured. "Better than anyone expected." Rogue shifted closer, placing his head against Mason's ribs again. A quiet declaration. "I'm staying." Mason exhaled, the last walls around his heart lowering. "Yeah," he whispered, resting a hand on Rogue's back. "You're home now." For the first time in a long, long while, Mason believed it. The healing had finally begun. Spring crept into Cedar Ridge with a gentler kind of light, the kind that didn't rush or demand anything. Snow thinned on the mountain edges. Pine needles glowed under the sun. And for the first time in a long time, the town breathed without a shadow hanging over it. 3 months had passed since Conrad Hale's arrest. 3 months of rebuilding. 3 months of figuring out what to do with a dog who wasn't wild at all, only wounded. Mason did not return to his old life. He didn't try to. Instead, he built something new from the pieces of it. The K-9 Recovery and Redemption Program stood where the old maintenance barn used to be. What had once been a place for tools, rust, and forgotten equipment now held training fields, quiet rooms, and open-air kennels designed for dogs who had been treated like weapons or abandoned after failing someone else's expectations. Rogue walked the grounds each morning like he owned them, not with arrogance, but with purpose. Other dogs, rescued from shelters, from the streets, from homes that didn't understand their fear, followed him with instinctive respect. A Labrador with burn scars, a Belgian Malinois who panicked at loud noises, a mixed shepherd too scared to eat unless someone sat beside him. But they followed Rogue, and Rogue followed Mason. Every sunrise, Mason watched from the porch of the new center, coffee in hand, bandage-free shoulder moving easily now. Rogue led the pack across the training yard, not barking, not pushing, just being a steady presence. His gait was strong, his posture confident. A dog who once trusted no one now guided the ones who didn't know how to trust yet. Carla stood beside Mason one morning, arms crossed lightly. "I still can't believe this place exists." Mason shrugged. It needed to. She smiled. "And Rogue. He's like your sergeant out there." Mason looked at the shepherd trotting along the fence line, checking corners, stopping only when a younger dog yelped in confusion. Rogue nudged the pup gently, then performed the command again, slow and deliberate. The pup copied him. The others watched. "He's more than that," Mason murmured. "He's the heart of this place." Word had spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. The town that once whispered fear about a dangerous dog now brought blankets, toys, old training gear, treats, even carpentry help to build ramps and shade structures. Children visited on weekends, running the obstacle course with the dogs. Retired veterans came by to offer free time and quiet presence for the more traumatized animals. And no one crossed into the yard without Rogue coming to greet them first, respectful, calm, leader-like. By mid-season, the redemption program became the one thing Cedar Ridge talked about with pride. Schools asked Mason to speak about compassion training. A regional rescue group offered grants. Even the sheriff's department wanted to partner in rehabilitating improperly trained working dogs. The fear that had once hovered over Rogue's name was gone. He had replaced it with something stronger. One afternoon, Mason took Rogue on their usual walk toward the higher ridge that overlooked the center. The path was familiar now. Packed dirt, a split boulder, a fallen cedar that stretched across the trail like an old guardian. Rogue walked ahead, but always looked back to make sure Mason was still there. When they reached the hilltop, the valley unfolded below them. The center, with its wooden fencing and long training yard, looked small but alive. Dogs barked faintly in the distance, their voices mingling with the breeze. Mason sank onto the grass, stretching his legs. Rogue stood beside him, chest expanding as he sniffed the air. His fur shifted slowly in the wind, gold against the mountain sky, a picture of strength and stillness. But Rogue wasn't looking at the center. He was staring at the tree line beyond it, the same forest where Conrad's men had once hidden, the same place Rogue had run from, the same place he had returned to again and again after the raid, as if waiting for something or someone. "What do you see out there?" Mason asked softly. Rogue didn't move, didn't blink. His ears twitched as if listening to a voice only he could hear. Mason followed the line of Rogue's gaze. The forest looked peaceful now, untouched by the violence it once concealed. But there was something in Rogue's stance, a quiet, patient alertness, like a chapter that hadn't fully closed. Mason leaned back on his elbows. "You know, we're allowed to rest now." Rogue finally looked at him, just for a second. Then he stepped forward to the ridge's edge and raised his head to the wind. He looked like a sentinel, a survivor, a dog who had seen too much but learned to carry it without letting it turn him bitter, a dog who still believed something lingered in the trees. Mason watched him, feeling that old pull in his chest, the mix of gratitude and sorrow held in perfect balance, the kind of peace that doesn't erase history but honors it. "You're not done, are you?" Mason whispered. Rogue didn't answer. He didn't have to. The wind pressed against his fur as he stared out at the forest, steady and unflinching. The same posture he had the night Conrad was captured. The same posture of a dog who remembered everything and forgave only what deserved forgiveness. Cedar Ridge was safe now, but Rogue still kept watch. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky in muted gold, Mason sat beside him. Quiet, present, letting the moment stretch without forcing it into meaning. Healing didn't require noise. Sometimes it lived in the silence after the storm. And on that hill, with Rogue standing tall against the fading light, the silence felt sacred. The morning the reporter arrived, Cedar Ridge was washed in a cool, silvery light, the kind that makes the mountains look older, wiser, as if they are listening. Mason stood by the fence with Rogue at his side, watching the dust trail of a small white SUV winding up the gravel road toward the program center. "She's early," Mason murmured. Rogue didn't look at him. He kept his gaze on the incoming vehicle, tail still, ears forward. Alert but not tense. Curious. The SUV stopped. A young woman stepped out, backpack slung over one shoulder, camera in hand. She had the posture of someone who had seen a lot despite her age, eyes sharp, steps measured. Her name was Natalie Brooks, an up-and-coming investigative journalist for a regional network. She had called 3 weeks ago, asking to do a special feature on the Redemption program. Mason expected one camera, one interview, a simple human interest piece. But the moment she stepped onto the grounds, Mason sensed something else. She wasn't here for a feel-good story. She was here to understand. "Morning, Mr. Clark," she said with a warm smile. "And this must be Rogue." Rogue didn't approach her. He simply stood, studied her, as if deciding what kind of person she was. Mason chuckled. "If he walks up to you in the next 5 minutes, consider it the highest honor." She nodded. "I've heard the stories." "People talk too much," Mason replied. "Maybe. But good stories tend to travel, especially when they're true." Natalie spent the first hour observing quietly. She watched Rogue guide the nervous Malinois through a confidence exercise. She watched him break up a scuffle between two anxious rescues with just a firm posture and a low rumble. She watched him sit beside a trembling lab who refused to come out of his crate for days. Rogue never forced, never pushed. He led. Finally, Natalie turned to Mason. He acts like he's teaching them. He is. And you trained him? No. Rogue trained himself. I'm just the one who listened. She wrote the sentence down immediately. When the interview began, she didn't start with easy questions. She started with the night it all happened. I need you to walk me through the attack, she said gently. Everything you remember. Mason hesitated. His throat tightened in that familiar way trauma has of reminding you it never fully leaves. But he told her. About the power outage, the intruders, the gunfire in the hangar, how Rogue shielded him without hesitation, how the dog remembered a different kind of violence from another life. Natalie listened with her entire attention. No blinking, no sighing, just taking in the truth. When he finished, she asked the question he avoided for months. Why was Rogue so willing to risk his life for you after everything he'd been through? Mason glanced at Rogue across the yard. The shepherd sat on the hill, watching other dogs play below. The wind brushed his fur. He looked peaceful but vigilant. Rogue didn't save me because I earned it, Mason said quietly. He saved me because he knew what it felt like to lose someone. Natalie's voice softened. Your K9 partner. Mason nodded once. The camera didn't miss the emotion in his jaw, or the way Rogue looked over at him the exact same moment, as if sensing the memory. Natalie spent the rest of the day interviewing residents. Kids who once feared Rogue now told her he was the bravest dog in the world. Sheriff Tate explained the investigation that exposed Conrad's ring. Carla and Lily described the transformation of a dog who had arrived feral, frightened, unpredictable, and who now led an entire community of broken animals to recovery. Everyone had a Rogue story, and none of them were about violence. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, Natalie packed up her gear. Before I go, there's one more question, she said. Why do you think Rogue survived everything he did? Mason expected to say something simple, but the words didn't come out simple. I think he knew he had more to do. Some dogs are born to protect, others are born to heal. Rogue, he's both. He survived because someone out there needed him. Maybe that someone was me. Maybe it's the dogs he's helping now. Maybe it's people who'll never even meet him. Natalie wrote it down, then closed her notebook as if sealing a truth inside it. 2 weeks later, the story aired across the entire state. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. Footage of Rogue guiding injured dogs. Interview clips of Mason describing trauma, survival, and second chances. Testimonies from Cedar Ridge residents admitting they had judged a dog they didn't understand. The segment ended with a slow shot of Rogue standing alone on the hill, the wind shifting his coat as he stared into the forest. Natalie narrated the final line. Some scars don't make a creature dangerous. Some scars make them brave. Within days, emails flooded the program. Families asking for help with their anxious dogs, shelters requesting assessments, veterans offering to volunteer, donations arriving with handwritten notes about rescue pets who changed their lives. And everywhere one phrase repeated, Rogue gave us hope. A week later, Mason found a mural being painted on the side of the old diner downtown. A large shepherd, strong and steady, standing above the words, Every life deserves a second chance. Rogue sat beside him, studying the mural with calm curiosity. Looks like you're famous, Mason said. Rogue didn't react to the comment. He just kept watching the painting, eyes steady, as if seeing something deeper than art. Maybe he knew what he had started. Maybe he knew this wasn't a story about survival anymore. It was a story about legacy. A legacy that carried itself in silence, in steady footsteps, in the quiet guidance of a dog who once had nothing and became the reason so many found their way back. As the evening faded and Cedar Ridge settled into its soft mountain dusk, Rogue lifted his head toward the forest again. Still watching, still guarding, still carrying the weight of every second chance he had helped create. The auditorium in Cedar Ridge wasn't large, but that afternoon it felt like the whole state had squeezed inside. Reporters filled every aisle, local families pressed shoulder to shoulder beside veterans, first responders, and rescue groups. Camera crews ran cables across the floor. Every screen displayed the same words. K-9 Recovery and Redemption Program Official Launch Ceremony. Mason stood backstage, adjusting the collar of a shirt he barely remembered choosing. Public events were still foreign to him. Spotlights, applause, attention, none of it came naturally. But Rogue sat beside him, calm and anchored, as if the noise meant nothing. "You ready?" Carla whispered. Mason glanced at Rogue. He's the one they came to see. Carla laughed. "They came for both of you." When they walked onto the stage, the crowd rose instinctively. Not with loud cheers, something quieter, heavier. Respect, gratitude, a recognition that both man and dog had survived more than most people ever would. Rogue didn't react to the attention. He walked with steady steps, tail low but confident, gaze scanning the room with the precision of someone who had learned to read danger long before he learned to read safety. The moderator introduced Mason, told the story of Rogue's rescue, the night of the attack, the aftermath, the formation of the program. Mason listened, hands folded, Rogue sitting tall at his side. Then a reporter in the front row raised a hand. "Mr. Clark, one question. Why did you keep Rogue with you through everything?" The room fell into a hush. It was a fair question. Some people had wondered it for months. Why trust a dog that once tore fences apart? Why stand beside an animal with a reputation for violence? Why choose a broken creature when the world had already taken so much from him? Mason didn't hurry his answer. He crouched beside Rogue, resting a hand gently on the shepherd's head. Rogue's ears twitched, leaning subtly into the touch. Mason spoke softly, but his voice carried. He wasn't dangerous. He was just waiting for someone who knew how to listen. A murmur rushed across the room. Cameras shifted. Pens froze mid-air. Something about the sentence hung there, suspended, simple, true, unavoidable. And suddenly the story wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about anyone who'd ever been misunderstood, anyone who'd ever needed a chance. Rogue looked up at Mason, eyes deep, amber, steady. The cameras zoomed in, catching the faint scars under his fur, the calm intelligence in his expression. Then something changed. Rogue lifted his head higher and turned toward the auditorium windows. The forested ridge stood far beyond the glass, but the dog's focus sharpened as if he could hear it breathing. His ears rose, finely tuned to a sound no human registered. Mason followed his gaze. "What is it, buddy?" Rogue didn't move, didn't growl, didn't tense, just listened. A whisper of wind passed the windows. The trees beyond swayed in a slow pattern. Something familiar, something old. A call not of danger, but of memory. A reminder that Rogue had come from the forest, from fire, from violence. A reminder that healing didn't erase the past. It carried it. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there was another dog waiting to be found, or another story waiting to begin. Mason rose slowly. The cameras focused on him now, expecting a final statement, a closing line to the ceremony, and maybe to the entire saga. Instead, he turned directly toward the main camera, the one broadcasting live across the state. His voice was steady. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" Silence followed. A deep, heavy silence. Then applause broke, loud and long, rising like a wave that filled the room and rolled straight out the doors into Cedar Ridge. Rogue remained still, listening to the forest one last time before turning back to Mason. The message was clear in his eyes. Their story wasn't over. Not for Rogue, not for the dogs in the program, not for the people who would find hope because of them. As the ceremony dissolved into warm conversation and reporters packed away their equipment, Mason knelt and wrapped one arm around Rogue's shoulders. "Let's get back to work," he whispered. Rogue pressed his head into Mason's chest, then trotted toward the exit, ready to return to the dogs waiting at the center, ready to guide them, ready to guard them, ready for whatever came next. And before the doors closed behind them, the final shot captured Rogue, standing proudly against the afternoon light, strong, calm, unbroken. A living symbol of second chances. To everyone watching, Mason's voice echoed once more. If this story touched your heart, support our mission. Support the dogs who are still waiting to be understood. And don't forget to follow and share the channel, because every German Shepherd deserves a voice. The screen faded out, but Rogue's legacy didn't.